Welcome back for another episode of the Eduardo series, where we're yet again in the book of Galatians, where we read of Paul's allegory with Sarah and Hagar representing the two covenants. The key point to remember as we're reading through this is that Paul is contrasting the flesh and the spirit, works by the flesh without faith, and faith in the promise by the Spirit. We'll get back to that, but first let's hear what Pastor Water has to say about it.
We pick up with the book of Galatians in chapter 4, where we heard read a moment ago concerning Paul's allegory. Two Old Testament women are used to represent the two covenants. In verse 21, Paul asks, "Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law?"
Notice the first thing Paul says in this allegory, "Do ye not hear the law?" That sounds kind of like Romans 7:1. For I speak to them that know the law. Just like we saw in episode 3, it's extremely important to know what the law says before we read Paul, or we may fall into the error of lawlessness.
For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman.
Where is it written that Abraham had two sons? If Paul takes the time to tell us about this, it's probably pretty important to know what it says so that we can correctly interpret what Paul is saying here. Paul's allegory comes from Genesis chapter 16 through 21, where it talks about the births of Abraham's sons Ishmael and Isaac from Hagar and Sarah. If we read these chapters, it will help us tremendously in correctly interpreting Paul's allegory.
But he who is of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these, that is, these women and their sons, are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth the bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now.
In Paul's allegory here, Hagar represents the covenant at Mount Sinai, and her son was born after the flesh, rather than through the promise of God to Abraham. Hagar also represents Jerusalem which now is, the Jerusalem of the first century at the time Paul is writing Galatians. Anyone who's read the New Testament knows that Jerusalem in Jesus' time was full of Pharisees and Sadducees who performed the works of the law without faith. This sounds like what Paul writes in Romans 9:31-33. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone, as it is written, Behold, I lay in Sion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. The Pharisees were a living example of what Mount Sinai produces without faith, only sheer obedience to the law by the power of the flesh. But Paul says here in Galatians 4:28-29, Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. In Paul's day, the apostles and all the believers who had faith and kept the law were being persecuted by the religious leaders who practiced the law but had no faith.
Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. For the son of the bondwoman should not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. The eighth reason as to why we don't keep the law of Moses is the fact that the bondwoman and her son have been cast out. Now, you go back to the book of Genesis in chapter 16, and you read about Abraham, his wife Sarah, and then the bondmaid or bondwoman, Hagar. So you have this bondwoman and her son. Her son was Ishmael. And then you had that arrangement representing the Old Covenant, or the Old Testament.
Hagar, in this allegory, represents Mount Sinai and the covenant made at Mount Sinai. Ishmael represents what Mount Sinai produces based on the works of the flesh without faith. Remember, Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness, and he was given the promise that his seed would become a multitude of nations. When it seemed that it wouldn't happen through Sarah, they tried to produce an heir through their own effort by the flesh, apart from faith, with Hagar. As typified by the bondwoman, Hagar and her son Ishmael, all the covenant at Mount Sinai can produce without faith is bondage. The result of seeking redemption or salvation by sheer obedience to the law without faith is bondage, because that's not what the law is for. It was never intended to be kept as a means of gain in salvation. Rather, the law was only given to a people after they were saved by the blood of the Lamb and were baptized in the Red Sea. The problem here is not with the law, but with the people. The covenant from Sinai is about God giving his perfect, holy, and just law to a people with a heart of stone. Remember, Paul is contrasting the flesh with the Spirit, not law versus grace or Old Testament versus New Testament, but the flesh, the works of the flesh, versus the Spirit. And since, as Paul says in Romans 8:9, that we are not in the flesh but in the Spirit, let us cast out the bondwoman and her son, that is, the works of the flesh. That's Hagar, but what does Sarah represent?
Then you have the free woman. The free woman is Sarah. The bond woman was Hagar. The son of the free woman, Sarah, was Isaac. And that arrangement represents the new covenant.
No. Pastor Eduardo is making two huge common mistakes in interpreting this allegory. One, assuming that the covenant made at Mount Sinai was to save Israel, and two, assuming that the other covenant is the new covenant. There is no mention of the new covenant at all here, so we have to stick with the context to figure out which covenants Paul is talking about. Both of these mistakes can easily be avoided if we search the scriptures to find the answer. Remember I said that when Paul said that it's written in the law that Abraham had two sons, that comes from Genesis 16 through 21? Let's look at that now. Just after Ishmael is born in Genesis 16, 15, and 16, we come to Genesis chapter 17. We already know that one of the two covenants that Paul is writing about in Galatians is the covenant at Sinai, but what's the other covenant? Let's read what Paul is writing from and see if we can figure it out. Genesis 17:2. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. Verse 4. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Verse 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. Verse 9. Thou shalt keep my covenant. Verse 10. This is my covenant. Verse 13. My covenant. Verse 14. My covenant. 19. My covenant. 21. My covenant. The word covenant appears 13 times in Genesis chapter 17. In this section that Paul is drawing from talking about two covenants, we know that one is the covenant at Mount Sinai because Paul spells it out for us. The other covenant is not the new covenant, but the covenant with Abraham. Abraham, Paul says, is the father of all them that believe. James 2:23 says, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Back to the book of Galatians, Paul says in Galatians 3:7, Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And verse 29, And if ye be Christ's, then ye are Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. And since we're children of Abraham, there's something very important that we need to realize about these two covenants. Both covenants contain the same law of God. Everyone knows that the law was given to Israel with the covenant at Mount Sinai, obviously, but concerning the covenant with Abraham, God said to Isaac, I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father, and I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Jesus said in John 8:39, If ye were Abraham's children, ye would do the works of Abraham. The difference between the covenant with Abraham and the covenant at Sinai is that Abraham had faith, while the children of Israel had no faith, with a heart of stone.
Then he asked, what saith the Scripture? The Scripture said, cast out the bondwoman and her son. So what do you have left? You're left with the free woman, her son, Sarah and Isaac, which represent the new covenant that came from Jerusalem. And so that's pretty clear, is it not, that the old covenant has been done away and the new covenant is binding.
This in no way proves anything about the new covenant. As we've seen, the two covenants Paul speaks of here in Galatians are the covenant at Sinai and the covenant with Abraham. There are many different covenants throughout the Bible, but based on the context, if we first know the law like Paul asks us to, Galatians 4 is talking about the covenant at Sinai and the covenant with Abraham. And what's the difference between the two? Abraham had faith, and afterward by that faith kept God's commandments out of loving obedience to his God, while Israel in the wilderness had no faith but a hardened heart of stone. Without faith, the only thing Mount Sinai can produce is a bunch of Pharisees and Sadducees trying to gain salvation by their works only through the effort of the flesh. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. We are no longer to walk in the flesh, but in the Spirit. And as believers who walk by faith in the Spirit, who have a heart of flesh and not a heart of stone, we are to have a spiritual mind that is subject to the law of God. We do not want to be like the stony-hearted Israelites in the wilderness, who didn't keep the law that God gave through Moses, which is why we, who now have a heart of flesh, do keep the law of Moses.
As to why we don't keep the law of Moses is the fact that the bondwoman and her son have been cast out. And so that's pretty clear, is it not, that the old covenant has been done away and the new covenant is binding.